Hello and welcome to Past, Present and Future, and I'm Russell Hurn. It's our first podcast for 2026, and to kick things off, we're going to meet one of our presenters at this year's UK conference in March. Peter Pruyn, who you may remember offered us a little bit of entertainment at the Liverpool conference last year, will be joining us in Bristol. Peter is an EMDR consultant and facilitator. He's an independent researcher and specialises in working with female survivors of trauma. That's one of the cases he'll be speaking about more at our Bristol conference. So a warm New Year's welcome to Peter. Hi, Peter.
Thank you, Russ. I'm honored to be here.
And it's lovely to have you. This is Past, Present and Future. We like to find out as much as we can about people in the EMDR community. So can you tell us a little bit about how you first came to EMDR?
Absolutely. So I guess there's how I came to psychotherapy and then how I came to EMDR. And I spent the first part of my career working in educational training and organizational development learning spaces. And I would say the main thing I learned from working in organizational development is that organizations over time take on the personalities of those who lead them. And so if the authority figure is interested in learning and willing to be self-reflective, you can do a lot. But if they're not, it's sort of like swimming upstream. So suddenly a large systems problem becomes an individual problem, and that nudged me to do clinical one-on-one work. And then completely coincidentally, every single supervisor I had during my training happened to be EMDR trained, except one. And so they would just talk about EMDR as part of the work. And I remember my first internship happened to coincide with when Francine Shapiro's Getting Past Your Past book came out. And so my supervisor mentioned it. I got it in a few weeks. I devoured it. And I don't know, there was just something about it that told me I want to do that. So when I had the opportunity, I got trained in EMDR, and that's about 10 years ago now.
What was it, do you think, about what your supervisor was saying that made you think, yeah, I want a piece of that?
You know, Russ, I still wonder myself. First of all, it just sounded needed. My first internship was working at a shelter for homeless veterans, and trauma was just pervasive in their background. So I knew I needed some tools to work with trauma. Um, and I guess there also just sounded something intrinsically fascinating about it. And I can't go back in time exactly to say what I thought or felt back then, but I don't know, maybe I just intuited that it was something about supporting the mind and body and doing something that it does well.
It's one of those things, isn't it? It sounds completely crazy bonkers to start with, but the more you find out, the more you go, yeah, that makes sense. I can see why that works.
Yes, exactly.
You mentioned coming from this organizational stance and noticing, trauma that maybe exists within companies. You're thinking about big systems. And I think it'd be fair to say that we have quite a few organizations that may be living in survival state at the moment in the UK, and I would put the NHS as one of those. But interesting, you said that from that perspective of thinking about how systems work, that's what drew you to the individual, and especially to working with women. What was it that kind of brought you to that line of work?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that I didn't set out in psychotherapy to work with a particular issue or population. Um, I think it's more that my clients chose me. And then there's the question of why is it that the overwhelming majority of my clients over my entire career have been women? And as far as I can tell, there are a few reasons for that. One is, first of all, women just have higher rates of trauma, PTSD, and sexual assault. But I think the second reason is why more men don't come, which is that I think conventional masculinity positions asking for help as failure. Another way to put that would be, I think vulnerability is patriarchy's kryptonite. And I can't often think of a more emotionally vulnerable moment than stepping into a therapist's office for the first time. So I think men are just less likely to ask for help in general.
I mean, you've written a bit about this and explored this, I think, and used the analogy of Billy Elliot as an example of trying to address some of the problems men have in accessing therapy. Can you say a little bit more? about this.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning Billy Elliot. It's one of my favorite movies. It's not only, I think, perfectly crafted, but I think it tells a wonderful story that can support us in understanding growth and trauma and healing. So when I first watched the movie, I was focused on Billy's journey to achieve his dream as a ballet dancer. But I have to say, many years later, having worked in EMDR, I watched it a second time and I was much more focused on the journey that his father goes through as Billy's gatekeeper, basically. Um, his father is an old school coal miner. He's never set foot outside of County Durham. The coal strike is going on. His wife died a year before. Um, they're in dire financial straits, and conventional masculinity prevents him from asking for help.
Mm.
And to put it one way is he doesn't know how to grieve. And there comes a moment where things get so difficult that finally he breaks down. And that's the beginning of his own healing. Um, Billy comes to him with the idea of wanting to do ballet, and he's initially completely dismissive. And it takes exposure to a second time of actually watching Billy inhabit joy in dancing. And I think in that moment, he realizes that the pain of him changing is less than the pain of not changing. And if he doesn't change, his son will not achieve his dream. And it's that moment that actually enables everything else to happen. And I think I overlooked that the first time.
I'm really glad you said that. And as soon as you mentioned his father, yeah, I went straight to the scene where Dad was crying, and that sense of relief. I think that his son is able to achieve whatever he wants, and he's enabled that. And yeah, that's a very powerful thing, and a lovely kind of second take on the film. And I think it's so amazing with films, isn't it, that we can do that. You watch it once, you get one story, you watch it again, you get a different story. And there's so many of these films now that are so powerful when we think about mental health and the experience of trauma.
Exactly. And I would just,
I could talk to you about films all day long. We've had this conversation before, so but we'll steer away from that for now. But let's come back to that work. So you finally get yourself trained in EMDR. You're out in therapy land, and all these clients are coming to see you. What do you find interesting about that work that was coming through the door for you that kept your EMDR going?
and I just want to mention here that I wouldn't be talking to you today if it wasn't for my EMDR mentor, Deborah Korn. It was a complete coincidence that I chose her as my initial consultant only because she was geographically closer. I had no idea that she was a prominent researcher and trainer um, in the global EMDR community, and I'm very grateful to
Well,
her.
I'm glad you said that because we've spoken to Deborah here on this podcast, and if you haven't heard that episode and you're listening today, then do check. Every memory deserves respect, which is a really interesting and very powerful read. Sorry, Peter. I just thought we ought to get that plug in there.
Of course, I'm glad you did. Yeah, so I think the turning point for me in focusing on EMDR for women's health came with a session about 4 years ago where a woman I've been working with for about 6 months whose presenting issue was anxiety began the session. This was online during the pandemic, saying that she was in so much period pain she didn't think she could continue the session. And it eventually came out that in addition to her complicated medical history, she was a lifelong sufferer of endometriosis, whose primary symptom is pain. And so we ended up using, I would say, a modified version of Mark Grant's pain protocol for 6 sessions specifically on her period pain. And prior to coming to do that work with me, she rated her peak period pain an 8 out of 10. And after 6 sessions focused specifically on her period pain, it reduced to a 4 out of 10. And that held up over an 18-month follow-up. So I was very impressed that that was even possible. I knew very little about endometriosis, but that prompted a deep dive into the complexity of that illness and how much women suffer from it because our medical system really is not equipped to diagnose this and treat it well. And one of the things I learned, for example, is that there's enormously high prevalence of the illness. It's actually 1 in 10 women experiencing it, which is the same as diabetes, and yet it's rarely talked about. Um, and then I looked into, well, EMDR has been used on chronic pain for decades. Endometriosis has been around for decades. Surely someone must have written about this. And I couldn't find anyone who had. And I'll also put a plug in for Hito Chudasama, who's chair of your Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, who was very encouraging of me taking this story wider, doing a webinar for the EMDR UK community, and writing up a version case story, both for a general audience and a clinical audience. Um, and then I decided to share that case story with other clients who had similar issues. Because one of the things I was learning was that women had astronomically higher rates of chronic pain than men, including migraines and pelvic pain. And they also had far higher rates of autoimmune issues. And what I was learning was is very often trauma was a contributing factor to these conditions. So, for example, in the case of endometriosis, individuals with acute to severe abuse histories have a full 79% higher chance of developing the condition. So, what my clients were effectively teaching me is that support for trauma and trauma healing, it seemed like needed to be an integral part of a holistic approach to women's health.
I'm just trying to understand that, Peter, and I was thinking with those numbers, it seems important for us to understand the component, the traumatic component that might be at play within these conditions, and how that contributes to a pain. If it's not the sole reason for the pain, it may be contributing and making it higher. Is that right?
Yes. So we need to start out by saying this is complicated, and we need to be careful as a community not to oversell EMDR as either a quick fix or a cure-all. But I think what we can say very simply is that emotional stress is normally held in the body as some form of physical tension. And physical tension makes pain worse. You know, when you get a toothache, you spend a lot of time not clenching your jaw because that makes the pain worse. So, independent of whatever physical or medical causes of the pain there may be, that psychotherapy will not be able to heal, there is always going to be a psychological component to the pain. And one of the most persistent forms of stress, of course, is post-traumatic stress. And EMDR is a good
Mm.
tool for helping that.
So I was imagining that, people generally, we have a weakness, don't we? I mean, mine might be my chest. If I have a cold, I'm just coming out of having a cold now, so it would go to my chest, and I'm coughing for a few weeks later. And so if there's a trauma, maybe trauma finds its way into an area of our body, a physical area that might be a little bit more vulnerable. Would that be right in saying?
No, I think so. And again, one of the challenges of this, as one of my NHS colleagues put it, is that women's health is chronically underfunded, under-researched, and under everythinged. That was her direct quote. And so we don't fully understand, for example, the causes of endometriosis. We don't have a complete cure for it. We don't understand the causes of many autoimmune issues. But it does kind of make intuitive sense that if you live with some degree of trauma, if you live with oppression, that's going to have physical consequences. And one of my colleagues suggests that there's this notion that if your body was designed to create another life, then your immune system is calibrated to taking care of two lives. And that may make it more susceptible to physical consequences of trauma.
Well, that's a really interesting point of view. I hadn't really thought of it like that. Um,
But we need to research that more to figure it out.
oh, yeah, absolutely. What is it, do you think, that means that EMDR seems to be so effective in treating physical pain?
Well, as I said, I think what we can suggest it can do is to treat the psychological component. So, one of the things I like to talk about with clients is the difference between chronic pain, pain that's happened frequently, and novel pain, pain that's never happened before. And really, the difference is the role of memory. So, if you nick your finger with a knife while chopping carrots and you've never done that before, it's going to sting. You might have some disbelief over it, but you're just dealing with that experience of it. And you go get a bandage and you rededicate yourself to chopping more carefully. If, however, you have an onset of a pain you're all too familiar with, whether a migraine or lower back pain or menstrual pain, it's very common for people to have a flood of negative cognitions, such as, oh no, not again. I hope it's not bad as that time when it was really bad. And then to cascade into concerns about the future, both, oh no, how long is this instance going to last? And is the rest of my life going to be like that? And all of that is the landscape of what EMDR can treat. And so I think that's one of the reasons why EMDR can be so effective on particularly taking the edge off chronic pain.
I think that's so interesting. And listening to you talk, I was kind of reminded of my mother who'd been bitten by a dog, and it just wouldn't heal. This injury she had, it was painful. It was, an open wound that wouldn't heal for months and months. And we worked together on that to understand what it was about this incident that had been so difficult. And for her, the memory was about not doing anything afterwards because she was afraid by not reporting this incident about the dog, because she didn't want to get the owners into trouble or have the dog put down. But she was afraid that that dog might then have gone on to hurt someone else. And there was that conflict within her. So when we processed that, then her wound healed. And it's fascinating the way that it works with the body, isn't it?
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought up that example because I think it's really important to add that one of the things that makes all of this worse for women is there's so much stigma associated with women's health issues. And I think a very basic truth from doing EMDR work is that silence makes pain worse, whether that is physical pain or emotional pain. Or as one of my colleagues likes to say, we are as sick as our secrets. And if you've been socialized to hide your menstrual pain from everyone, it's going to make it worse. And that's true of all forms of pain. And so there's kind of a double whammy here in women's health. And particularly, I would again cite endometriosis as the perfect storm of trauma. So you think about someone who had trauma in their childhood, they then experience the trauma of the illness itself, which often includes debilitating pain and infertility. And then there's the medical trauma that often comes from a system that isn't trained or under-resourced to accurately diagnose these conditions. So there are three levels of trauma in one illness, and that happens all the time in women's health. I think I'd also like to make a comment about the relationship between the micro and the macro. That is the relationship between individual behavior and larger trends in society. There is a researcher named Valerie Hudson who has spent 3 decades researching the dynamics of global gender inequality. And what she and her colleagues have determined is that there is a causal relationship between gender inequality and violence in a society. And there is conversely a causal relationship between gender equality and a more peaceful society. And you can think about this very simply. If men get what they want in the home through violence in their families, they translate that into getting what they want with each other in their communities. And when the whole country is like that, the dynamic plays out between countries. And conversely, if men learn to get what they want through relationship, that plays out in a positive way, both in their families and communities. So the book that Valerie wrote is The First Political Order: How Sex Shapes Governance Worldwide.
And I can see how there would be kind of almost a continuing cycle of events there as society plays out one thing, which goes into the home, which comes back into society. You mentioned previously that personal identity shapes clinical judgment. And that had been a specific learning point from you.
Yes, that was a motivation to do this workshop. So the workshop is trying to tie together first an opportunity to have a community conversation about cognitive interweaves, and to give an opportunity to really dissect a particular psychotherapy session. In this case, one that I did a few years ago, helping a client reduce her menstrual pain. The session is ultimately effective, but it's also imperfect, and I think will be grist for the mill for the community to talk about. But at the same time, it's an invitation to be self-reflective about how does our identity possibly influence our clinical choices? Would I, as a man, go about this session differently if I was a woman who had menstruated? I don't know, but I think it's a very important question that we therapists need to keep in mind.
Well, I know you're going to talk a lot more about this at the conference in Bristol, so we're really looking forward to it. I think I've already heard, that we need to think a little bit more about the research in this area. We need to think a little bit more about reducing the stigma, being able to speak about these secret pains or traumas that we're carrying. But also recognize the power of EMDR for working with pain. I think that's those three messages have come out very clearly from what you've said today, and I really look forward to hearing more about that in Bristol. And I know you're going to take us through an example of the work that you did with that client, which is another exciting opportunity because it's something we don't really get the chance to do sometimes in conferences. So looking forward to that, Peter. I can't let you go without kind of asking you a couple of things that are on my list. One I know is that you've got some great resources that are available through your website, which I'm sure you'll give us some details on in a minute. But of course, when you came to Liverpool, you entertained us all at the end with your renditions of Beatles songs, which seems totally appropriate for being in Liverpool. And we were all singing along with the EMDR version of the Beatles classics. I know that you've been working on a new one that might be quite useful for kids to sing along to as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Well, I'll just give the little background that I was a member of a Beatles ensemble band here, and I knew I was coming to the Liverpool conference. And as I would learn the Beatles songs, various EMDR phrases and jargon would pop into my head. And the moment when I realized I had to do these songs was when I realized that the abbreviation EMDR is actually a perfect lyrical stand-in for the abbreviation USSR. So I started with rewriting the lyrics to Back in the USSR to being I love EMDR. And I've just continued to do that. And I think the most energetic Beatles song, they didn't write it, but performed it, was Twist and Shout. And so I wanted to do something that would honor different aspects of our profession. And I have the utmost admiration for anyone who has done BLS with a small child. So I wanted to write a song that would honor EMDR child therapists. And so I rewrote the lyrics to Twist and Shout to be left and right.
We'll tap it out, baby, now. Left and right. Come on, come on, come on, come on, baby, now. Come on and tap it on out. We'll tap it on out.
Thank you, Peter. I will never hear that song in the same way ever again, but I can certainly imagine singing along to that with some kids that I work with. Thank you. And I know we've talked about other resources. There's a few that you'd like to suggest to us.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a few books. First, for those who want to learn about endometriosis, I also want to give a shout out to my endometriosis mentor, Heather Guidone, who's surgical program director at the Center for Endometriosis Care in Atlanta, Georgia. And she highly recommends a book called Beating Endo: How to Reclaim Your Life from Endometriosis by Iris Orbuch and Amy Stein. And for a general audience, I found the most accessible book on women's health is titled The Vagina Book. It's actually written by a company that makes period-proof underwear, Thinks, with a OBGYN, Dr. Jen Conti. And then I'll also mention my own website, which is emdrforwomenshealth.com. That's EMDR for womenshealth.com, one word, where I include some of the case stories that I've mentioned and links to some other things. And then I'll also just mention that I am in the process of putting together a book that is a collection of 10 EMDR case stories. And the working title is EMDR Stories, Women's Journeys of Healing, Health, and Hope. And one of those chapters will be the basis of the presentation in Bristol.
Well, we certainly look forward to seeing you in Bristol in March. If you haven't got your tickets, everyone go to emdrassociation.org.uk to make sure you register. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We've got a lot to look forward to when we see you in March. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Russ. I look forward to seeing you in Bristol.
Past, Present and Future is a Laura Beach production for EMDR UK.